Tom Wilkins had always believed that some jobs were just that, jobs. After 30 years as a plumber, he had seen every kind of mess a person could create with water and metal. He had patched leaks in houses that were barely standing, pulled diamond rings out of drains for sobbing homeowners, and once even found a live snake coiled inside a toilet pipe. But none of that compared to what he was about to uncover inside Eleanor Kensington's aging Victorian home. The call had come in like any other. A simple issue, low water pressure in the kitchen. Nothing unusual. Nothing complicated. But when he pulled up in front of the house, something about it gave him pause. The structure was one of those towering, grand old places that had stood through storms and wars, its black iron fence rusting at the edges, its gabled roof casting long shadows over the unkempt lawn. The windows, tall and narrow, looked more like watchful eyes than glass panes. It wasn't uncommon for an old house like this to have plumbing problems. Many of them still had pipes installed before the Second World War. But what was uncommon was the woman who answered the door. Eleanor Kensington was thin, her frame wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the afternoon. Her hands, aged and delicate, gripped the edge of the door as she peered at him, eyes sharp beneath layers of time-weathered skin. "You're the plumber?" Her voice was careful, like she was testing the weight of each word. "Yes, ma'am. Tom Wilkins. You called about a water pressure issue." She hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The air inside was thick, heavy, with the scent of old books and faded perfume. It wasn't just the smell of time, it was the smell of a life long lived in one place, where memories clung to the walls like unseen ghosts. The furniture was well-worn but carefully arranged, and the wooden floor creaked under his boots as she led him to the kitchen. "It's been weak for weeks," she muttered, wringing her hands together. "I keep thinking it'll get better," but her voice trailed off. Tom nodded absently, already assessing the situation. He turned on the tap, watched the water trickle out in a sad, thin stream. The issue wasn't in the faucet itself, which meant there was a blockage somewhere deeper in the system. Probably old rust, maybe mineral buildup, things he had dealt with 1,000 times before. He dropped to one knee, knocking lightly on the pipes beneath the sink, listening for inconsistencies. And that's when he noticed something odd. The sound wasn't right. Instead of the hollow, metallic ring of an empty pipe, it was dull, solid, like something was inside, wedged tight. "I'll need to check the main line under the floorboards," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Shouldn't take too long." Eleanor hesitated. "You mean under the house?" "Yeah, just for a quick look." A strange expression flickered across her face, one Tom couldn't quite place. Worry? Fear? It was gone as quickly as it came. She stepped back, nodding stiffly. "All right, just be careful down there." He gave her a reassuring smile and grabbed his toolbox. Minutes later, he was squeezing through the narrow crawl space beneath the kitchen, the cool dampness pressing in around him. Dust and cobwebs clung to his arms as he shone his flashlight along the pipes, scanning for corrosion or debris. And that's when he saw it. A section of the old lead pipe had bulged outward unnaturally, like something inside was pressing against its walls. He frowned, reaching for his wrench. A few careful turns, a steady pull, and then the pipe burst open in his hands. A cascade of dirt and debris poured out onto the wooden beams beneath him, clattering against the earth below. But it wasn't just dirt. Something heavy, something metallic, tumbled down with it, catching the dim light of his flashlight. His breath hitched. Coins. Not just any coins, gold coins. They spilled from the broken pipe like hidden treasure, their surfaces dulled by time but unmistakably valuable. Tom reached for one, turning it between his fingers, brushing away decades of grime. The engraving on the face was intricate, unfamiliar. Not modern currency, something older. Something rare. He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He had heard stories before. People finding forgotten money stashed away in walls, beneath floorboards. But this was different. Carefully, he reached back into the pipe, feeling around for more. His fingers met something solid. Not just one, not just a handful. Dozens. His mind raced. Who had hidden them? Why? And how long had they been sitting here, trapped in the bones of this house? He exhaled sharply and started scooping the coins into his work pouch, heart pounding with something that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite excitement. His hands were trembling when he finally crawled backward out of the crawl space, his mouth dry, his thoughts tangled. He dusted himself off, his mind still trying to process what he had just found. But when he turned to Eleanor, expecting surprise or maybe even joy, he saw something else entirely. Her face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a tight, bloodless line. Her fingers were clenched at her sides, knuckles white. But it was her eyes that unnerved him most. Not wonder, not excitement, dread. You shouldn't have touched them. Her voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it, something sharp-edged with something that almost sounded like fear. Tom frowned. Mrs. Kensington, do you know what these are? She took a slow step back, shaking her head. Put them back. His stomach dropped. Excuse me. You heard me. Her voice trembled, but her gaze was unflinching. Put them back where you found them. No. Tom's fingers tightened around the pouch of coins at his side. Something was very, very wrong. Whatever he had just dug up, it wasn't just old money. It was something else. Something bigger. And from the way Eleanor was looking at him, it was something he wasn't supposed to have found. Tom Wilkins had expected shock. He had expected maybe a little disbelief, maybe even excitement. After all, who wouldn't be thrilled to discover a cache of ancient gold coins in their own home? But what he saw on Eleanor Kensington's face was something entirely different. It wasn't just worry. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something like a ghost from the past had just walked into the room. The air in the kitchen grew heavy as she stared at him, her breath shallow, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of silence stretched between them, pressing against Tom's chest. You shouldn't have touched them, she whispered again, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Tom frowned, shifting uneasily. Mrs. Kensington, I don't think you understand what I just found. These coins, they're not just old, they're ancient. We're talking pre-Civil War, maybe even older than that. Someone put them there, and from the looks of it, they wanted them to stay hidden. He hesitated before adding, maybe you should sit down. She shook her head sharply, stepping backward, her gaze darting toward the window as if she expected someone to be standing outside, watching. The movement made her seem smaller, more fragile, like the weight of whatever secret she carried was suddenly too much for her frail frame to bear. Mrs. Kensington. She inhaled shakily and turned her sharp gray eyes back to him. I need you to listen to me very carefully, Mr. Wilkins. Her voice, though trembling, was firm, her tone leaving no room for argument. Put them back. Tom felt a slow, uneasy chill creep up his spine. I don't think that's a good idea, he admitted. Look, I know this is a shock, but these could be worth a fortune. There could be records, a paper trail, maybe your family. Her eyes darkened instantly, and something in her face hardened. No. The force behind that single word sent a shiver through him. This house, she said slowly, her voice quieter now, but no less commanding, has secrets that need to stay buried. Tom swallowed. You know where these coins came from, don't you? Silence. He took a step forward, his curiosity now overriding his unease. Mrs. Kensington, if you know something. I said no. The sudden outburst startled him. It wasn't just anger, it was desperation. a plea wrapped in the sharp edges of panic. Her shoulders rose and fell as she steadied herself, her fingers gripping the back of a wooden chair so tightly that Tom could see her knuckles whitening. Then, as if catching herself, she took a deep breath and released the chair, pressing her hands together to stop them from shaking. "I don't expect you to understand," she finally said, her voice almost too quiet to hear. "And I don't expect you to listen. But if you do listen, you will take those coins back to where you found them. You will seal that pipe, and you will forget you ever saw them." Tom hesitated, every logical part of him screaming that something was very, very wrong here. "I can't do that, Mrs. Kensington," he finally said. "I need to know what I'm dealing with. If there's something about this house that I should know." "Then you'll be digging up more than you're ready for," she interrupted, her tone ice cold. Something about the way she said it sent a ripple of unease through him. Tom had spent his entire life fixing things, patching leaks, sealing cracks, making sure the water flowed smoothly where it was supposed to go. But this wasn't something he could fix with a wrench. This was something else entirely. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor walked to the edge of the kitchen, to a small cabinet near the window. She opened it with careful fingers, reaching inside. Tom felt himself tense. For a brief second, he thought she was reaching for a weapon. But when she turned around, her hands were empty. Instead, she was holding something small, something wrapped in faded cloth. She placed it on the kitchen table between them, and then, with a deep breath, peeled back the fabric. Tom leaned in. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. It was a coin, just like the ones he had pulled from the pipe. But this one was different. The metal was still gold, still aged, but it bore an engraving that sent a shiver through him. It wasn't just any coin. It bore the mark of a historical figure whose name still echoed through textbooks and museums. A figure associated with wealth, rebellion, and most notably, betrayal. Tom's blood ran cold. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. Eleanor closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was something distant in her gaze. Something haunted. "Mr. Wilkins," she murmured. "You don't understand what you've found." Tom stared at the coin, then at her. And for the first time in his life, he felt as if he had just stepped into a story much larger than himself. Tom Wilkins couldn't shake the weight of Eleanor Kensington's words, nor could he tear his gaze away from the aged gold coin resting on the table between them. His pulse drummed in his ears as he traced his fingers lightly over the intricate engraving. It wasn't just some old piece of currency. This coin was something much more, something tied to history in a way he didn't yet understand. Eleanor's sharp eyes remained locked onto his, her expression unreadable, but Tom could feel the tension radiating from her in waves. It was like she was waiting for him to put the coin down, waiting for him to listen to her warning, waiting for him to turn around and leave this house forever. But he wasn't that kind of man. He never had been. He let out a slow breath, straightened up, and met her gaze. "Mrs. Kensington," he said carefully, "I don't know what you're afraid of, but I do know that coins like these don't just end up inside old pipes by accident. Someone put them there. Someone hid them. And if you know why, I think you owe it to yourself to say it out loud." Eleanor's mouth pressed into a tight line, but she didn't say a word. Tom shook his head, exhaling through his nose. "All right, if you won't tell me, I'll find out myself." He turned on his heel, grabbed his toolbox, and headed for the front door. He had barely made it 2 steps before her voice, quiet but firm, stopped him in his tracks. "You won't find the truth in books, Mr. Wilkins." Tom glanced over his shoulder. "Then where will I find it?" She hesitated. "In the walls." The way she said it sent a chill through him, but she said nothing more. She simply stood there, hands clasped in front of her, waiting for him to make his choice. Tom turned back toward the door and stepped out onto the porch, the warm afternoon air doing little to shake the cold feeling that had settled in his bones. He wasn't a historian. He wasn't an investigator. He was just a man who fixed broken things. But something deep in his gut told him this wasn't about fixing anymore. This was about uncovering. And so, instead of driving off like he should have, he pulled out his phone and started making calls. An hour later, Tom found himself seated in front of a computer at the local archives, scrolling through public records on the Kensington house. It didn't take long for the first red flag to appear. The house wasn't just old, it had been in Eleanor's family for generations. The first recorded owner of the property was a man named Jeremiah Kensington, a name that didn't ring any bells to Tom, at least not at first. But as he dug deeper, as he cross-referenced the records with historical news articles, something started to take shape. Jeremiah Kensington hadn't just been a homeowner. He had been a merchant. And not just any merchant, a wealthy one whose name was tied to a long-forgotten controversy that had nearly erased him from history. Tom's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his heart pounding as he opened an old newspaper scan from the mid-1800s. The print was faded, but the headline was still legible. Wealthy trader accused of treason, fortune disappears amid scandal. Tom leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the article. Jeremiah Kensington had been more than just a businessman. He had been a supplier of goods during the Civil War. But the article hinted at something darker, something unsaid. It suggested that his fortune had been built on more than just trade. It suggested that his wealth had come from dealings that were not entirely legal. And then one sentence stood out above the rest. Rumors persist that Kensington's missing gold was never lost, only hidden. Tom's stomach dropped. Had he just found that missing gold? Tom ran a hand through his hair, staring at the screen. If the article was right, then these weren't just old coins, these were relics from a scandal that had been buried for over a century. But why hide them in the plumbing? His mind raced back to the engraving on the coin Eleanor had shown him. He had recognized part of it but hadn't been able to place it. Now he pulled out his phone and took another look at the picture he had snapped of it before he left. He zoomed in. There was a marking on the edge, almost too worn to see. A date, 1865, and beneath it, an inscription in Latin. Tom's Latin was rusty, non-existent, really, but he knew enough to punch the words into a translation app. When the English result appeared on his screen, he felt the breath leave his lungs. What is stolen must never be returned. The words sent a shiver through him. Stolen from who? And why did Eleanor seem so desperate to keep them buried? Tom knew he had to go back. The moment he pulled into Eleanor's driveway, he could see the curtains shift slightly. She had been watching for him. He knocked on the door, and it opened almost instantly, as if she had been standing on the other side, waiting. "You found something," she said, not asking, stating. Tom held up his phone. "I think I found something. But I don't think I found everything." Eleanor's lips pressed together. "You should have left it alone." Tom exhaled. "Mrs. Kensington, I think your ancestor was part of something big. Something that people wanted erased from history." Silence. He studied her face carefully. She wasn't surprised. If anything, she looked resigned. "Tell me what you know," he urged gently. "Because if I'm right, there's more in this house than just those coins. And if I found them by accident, someone else could too." Eleanor's expression remained unreadable, but after a long moment, she turned and gestured for him to follow her inside. She didn't take him to the kitchen. She didn't take him to the crawl space. She took him to the fireplace in the main sitting room. And then, without a word, she reached up and pressed a hidden latch along the wooden mantel. With a soft click, part of the fireplace swung inward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. Tom's breath caught in his throat. "There's more to this house than you know, Mr. Wilkins," Eleanor said quietly, stepping aside. "And I hope, for your sake, you're ready for what comes next." Tom stared into the darkness beyond the secret door, his pulse pounding. He had come here to fix a pipe. Now he was about to uncover something that had been hidden for over a century. And deep in his gut, he knew this was only the beginning. Tom Wilkins had expected a lot of things when he walked back into Eleanor Kensington's house, but we hadn't expected with a hidden passageway behind the fireplace. His breath felt tight in his chest as he stared into the narrow darkness beyond the swinging wall panel, the scent of aged wood and dust creeping into his nostrils. This wasn't just an old house with some forgotten gold. This was something else, something bigger. Eleanor stood beside him, her frail hands trembling slightly against the mantelpiece. But her face was unreadable, her expression carved into something almost haunted. "This house," she said quietly, "has secrets older than I am." Tom turned to her, searching her gaze for any sign of hesitation, any indication that she might try to stop him from going inside. But there was none. Instead, there was something else, something like acceptance. Without another word, she stepped back, giving him room to enter. Tom inhaled deeply and pulled out his flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the heavy darkness as he took his first step inside. The air was thick, unmoving, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The walls were lined with brick, rough and uneven beneath his fingertips, and the passage was so narrow that he had to turn slightly sideways to move deeper in. Behind him, Eleanor's voice carried softly through the stillness. "My grandfather told me stories when I was a girl. He said this house was built with hidden places, that some rooms were never meant to be found again." Tom swallowed hard. "Why?" Eleanor hesitated. Then softly, "Because some things are meant to be forgotten." A chill crawled down Tom's spine, but he kept moving. The passage was only about 10 feet long before it opened up into a small, concealed room. The moment he stepped inside, he knew this place hadn't seen the light of day in a very long time. A single wooden chair sat in the middle of the room, its legs covered in dust. Against the far wall, an old wooden chest lay partially open, its lid slightly askew as if someone had once been in the middle of retrieving something but never finished. And along the walls, Tom's breath caught. There were names carved into the bricks. Dozens of them. Some were barely visible, their edges softened with age, while others still stood out sharply as if the person who had scratched them in had done so with urgency. He stepped closer, running his fingers over the etched letters. Sarah J. 1852. Daniel W. 1861. Elias K. 1865. His mind raced. Were these names of people who had lived here? Or were they something else, something darker? He turned back toward the chest, the uneasy weight in his stomach growing heavier. If there were answers to be found, they were in there. Carefully he knelt, placing his hands on the dust-covered lid, and with a slow, measured breath, he pulled it fully open. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed cloth and the scent of decay, something waited. A stack of letters, neatly bundled, their edges brittle with age. Tom reached in carefully, pulling out the topmost envelope, his fingers trembling slightly. The paper was delicate, the ink faded, but he could still make out the handwriting. Elegant, looping, desperate. Eleanor stepped inside the room then, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. She didn't speak, but Tom could feel her presence behind him, watching, waiting. Slowly, carefully, he opened the letter. The words inside sent a shiver through his entire body. June 14th, 1865. To the one who finds this. If these words have reached you, then the truth has finally been uncovered. My name is Elias Kensington, and if history remembers me at all, it will remember a lie. I did not steal this gold. I did not betray the Union. I did not sell men into chains. But my family did. Tom felt his breath hitch. His eyes darted back to Eleanor, but she said nothing, just stared at him, her expression unreadable. He swallowed and kept reading. I was born into a name that carried wealth, but that wealth was built on the backs of others. My father, Jeremiah Kensington, was no simple merchant. He was a broker in lives, a man who traded in bodies and futures. He profited from war. He profited from misery. And when the war ended, when the Confederacy fell, he did what men like him always did. He hid his sins in the dark and hoped the world would forget. This gold was not his fortune. It was his guilt. He paid men to silence the truth. He bribed officials to erase records. And when he realized that even gold could not erase his legacy, he buried it, just as he buried the men who knew too much. I could not stop him, but I could make sure the truth was never lost. If you are reading this, then you must decide. Do you let history remain the lie it has always been? Or do you unearth what should have never been forgotten? My hands are too stained with inaction to make that choice, but yours are not. May you choose wisely. Because Tom's hands trembled as he lowered the letter, his breath coming in uneven bursts. Eleanor still hadn't moved. She was watching him, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to be the first to say what they both knew now. Her family's wealth, her entire legacy had been built on this. Not just trade, not just business, but on the buying and selling of human lives. And her ancestor, Elias Kensington, had tried to atone for it, but he had failed. Tom felt his pulse roaring in his ears. The weight of what he had just learned pressed down on him like something physical, something suffocating. Eleanor took a slow, shaky breath. Now you understand. Tom turned to her, searching her face. You knew. A long pause. Then softly, I suspected. Tom clenched his jaw, running a hand through his hair. Jesus Christ, Eleanor. This isn't just some family secret. This changes things. She exhaled heavily. And what are you going to do about it? Tom stared at her, the words of the letter echoing in his mind. Do you let history remain the lie it has always been? Or do you unearth what should have never been forgotten? He looked back at the stack of letters in the chest, back at the gold, back at the names on the walls, and deep in his gut he knew he was standing at a crossroads. Whatever choice he made next would change everything. Tom Wilkins felt the weight of history pressing down on him, thick and suffocating like the dust in a secret chamber. The letter in his trembling hands was more than just old ink on yellowed paper. It was a confession, a testament to a crime buried beneath generations of wealth and silence. And he had just dug it up. The truth lay scattered before him, the ancient gold coins, the list of names carved into the brick, the letter from Elias Kensington revealing the sinister past his father had tried to erase. Tom could almost hear the echoes of the past reverberating in the dimly lit room. This wasn't just about hidden treasure. It wasn't just about a forgotten fortune. It was about the price of silence. He turned toward Eleanor, who stood near the entrance of the secret room, her expression unreadable. For the first time since he had met her, she looked small, fragile, in a way that had nothing to do with age. She had spent her life living in this house, surrounded by its ghosts, burdened by whispers she had never dared to speak aloud. And now those whispers had turned into screams. Tom inhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face, trying to steady his thoughts. Eleanor, he said slowly, his voice hoarse, this isn't just some family scandal. Your ancestors' fortune, it was built on something horrible. And Elias, he tried to expose it. He tried to make it right. He gestured toward the letter, his heart pounding. But he failed, didn't he? Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to respond, but no words came. Tom took a step closer. Didn't he? Finally, she spoke. He disappeared. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Tom swallowed. Disappeared. Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the dusty floor. There's no record of him after 1865. No death certificate. No burial site. One day he was here. The next, he was gone. Tom's mind raced. You think someone, he stopped himself, forcing his thoughts into order. You think Jeremiah Kensington got rid of his own son? A long, painful silence. Then softly, I don't think. I know. Tom felt a sickening weight settle in his stomach. Jesus Christ. Elias Kensington hadn't just failed in exposing the truth. He had paid for it. Tom's flashlight flickered slightly as he turned back to the chest, his pulse thrumming in his ears. If Elias had tried to expose his father's crimes and had vanished before he could, then there was a good chance Jeremiah had made sure he was never found. Which meant Tom exhaled sharply, his throat dry. Eleanor, he said carefully, do you know if your grandfather ever mentioned where Elias disappeared? Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her shawl. He only ever said that the house remembers what men try to forget. A shiver crawled up Tom's spine. He turned back to the chest, shifting aside the stack of letters, his hands moving faster now, his instincts screaming that something was still waiting to be found. As his fingers brushed the bottom of the wooden box, he felt it. Groove. A hidden panel. He sucked in a sharp breath, then carefully pressed against the edge of the wood. The panel gave slightly under the pressure, revealing a small compartment beneath. Inside, wrapped in layers of time-worn cloth, was something heavier than paper. Something solid. Something human. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he carefully unwrapped the fabric, revealing the brittle, time-darkened remains of a skeletal hand. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring as his mind struggled to comprehend what he was looking at. Bones. Buried beneath a century of secrets. Eleanor let out a sharp gasp behind him, her frail hands covering her mouth. Tom's stomach twisted violently as he stared at the remains. Was this Elias Kensington? Had his own father murdered him to keep his sins buried? The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This house wasn't just built on stolen money. It was built on blood. Tom felt his fingers twitch with adrenaline, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just uncovered. This wasn't just hidden gold. This wasn't just an old crime. This was a murder scene. And it had been waiting, buried, for over 150 years. Jesus Christ, Tom whispered under his breath, his heartbeat a drum against his ribs. Eleanor, this is a crime. We have to tell someone. Eleanor, pale as a ghost, shook her head. No. Tom's brow furrowed. What do you mean, no? Her fingers clenched together, her body trembling. Don't you understand? If this gets out, if they trace this back, it won't just be a story about Jeremiah Kensington. Her breath shuddered. It'll be a story about me, about my family, about my name. Tom stared at her, barely able to process what she was saying. Eleanor, people deserve to know the truth. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time Tom saw it, not fear, guilt. A lifetime of silence. A lifetime of choosing to look the other way. You don't know what it's like, she whispered. You don't know what it's like to carry a name built on sins you never committed. You don't know what it's like to be trapped in a house that still remembers them. Tom's mouth went dry. You want to know why I never left, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I couldn't. Because this house, this history, it owns me. She shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. You think I don't know what my family did. You think I don't know that every piece of silver in this house was paid for in suffering? Her voice cracked. I know. I've always known. Silence. Tom exhaled, his shoulders heavy. He didn't know what to say, because part of him understood. Part of him saw the impossible choice she had lived with her entire life. She could tell the truth and destroy everything attached to her family's name, or she could stay silent, just like the generations before her. Tom's gaze flickered toward the skeletal hand resting in the open chest. The truth was staring him in the face. He had uncovered the past. Now he had to decide what to do with it. Tom Wilkins had spent his life making simple choices. Fix the pipe or replace it. Tighten the valve or leave it alone. But standing in that secret room, staring at the brittle bones of a man who had died protecting the truth, he realized this wasn't simple. This was a choice that would change everything. Eleanor Kensington's breathing was uneven, her frail hands gripping the edges of the fireplace as if the weight of the past was pressing down on her. In the dim light, she looked smaller, older, more fragile than she had before. But her eyes, those sharp, storm-gray eyes, still burned with something fierce. She was afraid, not just of what they had found, but of what came next. Tom wiped the sweat from his brow, his pulse thrumming in his ears. Eleanor, he said, his voice quieter now, careful. We can't just leave him here. He gestured to the remains, to the crumbling bones in the chest. This isn't right. This man, Elias, he tried to stop it. He tried to expose what his father did, and he died for it. Eleanor inhaled sharply. And what do you think will happen if this gets out? Her voice wavered, but her hands were steady. What do you think people will say? Tom ran a hand over his face, already knowing where this was going. They'll dig up everything, she continued, her voice cold, factual. They'll tear this house apart. My family name, my father's name, it will be destroyed. They'll turn my home into a museum, a crime scene. Every headline will say the same thing. Eleanor Kensington, last of the Kensington line, descendant of murderers and slavers. She swallowed. You don't understand, Mr. Wilkins. When a house is built on bones, it's not just the dead who get buried. Tom exhaled through his nose, clenching his jaw. I don't give a damn about the Kensington name. She let out a bitter laugh. Then why are you still here? That stopped him. Why was he still here? Why hadn't he just packed up, walked away, called the cops? Because something about this didn't sit right. Because something about the way Eleanor spoke, the way she pleaded without pleading, made him wonder if he was staring at a woman who had been trapped her whole life in a house full of ghosts. She turned to him then, slow and deliberate. I'll make you an offer. Tom narrowed his eyes. An offer? She nodded. I'll give you the gold. Silence. Tom felt his stomach drop. You're joking. She shook her head. Take it. It's worth more than you've made in your lifetime. You found it, didn't you? You uncovered it. It's yours now. Tom couldn't believe what he was hearing. You want me to steal it? She let out a breathy laugh. No one owns stolen gold, Mr. Wilkins. You wouldn't be stealing a damn thing. Tom clenched his fists. You want me to take the gold, keep my mouth shut, and pretend this never happened? Eleanor said nothing, but the silence spoke for her. Tom turned away, dragging a hand down his face. This was insane. He was standing in a house full of history, real history, holding the bones of a man who had died trying to do the right thing. And now, Eleanor was offering him a way out. Take the gold. Leave the past alone. Just another job. Another day. Tom inhaled deeply. Then, slowly, he turned back to her. You know, he said, his voice quiet, I've spent my whole life fixing things. He gestured around the room. Pipes, valves, Stuff people don't think about. Stuff that keeps their houses standing. Eleanor tilted her head, watching him closely. Tom exhaled. But sometimes things aren't meant to be patched up. Sometimes you have to tear it all down. Her expression darkened. You're making a mistake. Tom shook his head. No, Eleanor. Your family made the mistake. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked truly tired. Tom squared his shoulders. I can't take it. She closed her eyes briefly, as if she had expected this answer but had hoped he'd prove her wrong. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. Then what are you going to do? Tom looked down at the letter still in his hands. The words of Elias Kensington stared back at him. If you are reading this, then you must decide. History remembers the lie, but you can choose the truth. Tom swallowed. I'm going to finish what Elias started. Eleanor's face didn't change. Not at first. Then slowly, her shoulders dropped, the tension slipping from her frame like a breath being exhaled after years of holding it in. And for the first time since he had met her, he saw something else in her expression. Relief. Tom could still feel the weight of Eleanor's words pressing against his ribs as he stood outside her house, the night air cold against his skin. The choice was made. He had left the goal behind. He had left her behind. But he hadn't left the truth. The letter from Elias Kensington was folded carefully in his pocket, the brittle paper pressed against his chest like a heartbeat. Tomorrow, he would take it to someone who could make sure it was seen. The police, maybe. A historian. A journalist. He wasn't sure yet. All he knew was that he couldn't let it stay buried. As he looked up at the old Victorian house, its windows glowing dimly from the inside, he wondered what would become of Eleanor now. Would she stay in a house among the ghosts of her past? Or had his choice freed her too? He may never know. All he knew was that his hands were clean. And for the first time in a long time, he felt lighter. Tom Wilkins had walked away from a lot of jobs in his life. Some were unfinished, some were botched, and some simply weren't worth the trouble. But this was the first time he had walked away knowing he had uncovered something far bigger than himself, something that couldn't stay buried. As he drove through the quiet streets of town, the letter from Elias Kensington sat in the passenger seat beside him, its weight feeling heavier than it should. It wasn't just paper. It wasn't just ink. It was truth. And truth had consequences. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter as he thought about what would happen next. The moment he turned this letter over, whether to the police, a journalist, or a historian, everything would change. The Kensington name would no longer be associated with old money and respect. It would be tied to murder and betrayal. Eleanor would lose whatever legacy she had left. And that house, the one that had stood for over a century, wouldn't just be a home anymore. It would be a crime scene, a house of horrors, a symbol of everything people wanted to forget. Tom exhaled through his nose, his mind racing. Was he really prepared for that? Was he ready to tear down an entire family's history just because he had stumbled onto it? His gut told him yes, but his conscience wasn't so sure. Tom didn't go straight to the police. He told himself it was because he needed time to think, that he wanted to be sure he was doing the right thing. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was hesitating, not because he doubted what he had found, but because he knew once he set this in motion, there was no turning back. He spent the night staring at the letter, reading it over and over again, as if the words would change. As if Elias himself would rewrite history and offer Tom an easier path. But the words never changed. If you are reading this, then you must decide. History remembers the lie, but you can choose the truth. Tom sighed heavily, rubbing his hands over his face. Eleanor had been right about one thing. Once this story came out, the world would never see her family the same way again. But did that really matter? Did an old woman's reputation hold more weight than the suffering of the people whose names were carved into that hidden room? Did a house deserve to stand if it had been built on blood? Tom closed his eyes. The answer was obvious. It was almost midnight when the knock came. 3 sharp raps against his motel room door. Tom's breath caught. He wasn't expecting anyone. His heart pounded as he slowly stood, his muscles tense as he made his way toward the door. He hesitated for a moment, then cracked it open just enough to see who was on the other side. Eleanor. She stood in the dim hallway, wrapped in that same faded shawl, her expression unreadable. Tom exhaled, unlocking the door fully. Jesus, Eleanor, what are you doing here? She stepped inside without asking, her frail hands clutching each other as if she were trying to keep herself from shaking. She glanced at the letter on the motel desk, then back at him. You didn't turn it in, she said softly. Tom crossed his arms. Not yet. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Eleanor spoke. You were right. Tom blinked, caught off guard. What? She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. I spent my whole life pretending it wasn't true, telling myself the past was just the past. But it isn't, is it? She shook her head, her gray eyes shining in the dim light. It never was. Tom stayed silent, letting her speak. She laughed bitterly. I thought if I kept quiet, I could live with it. I thought maybe if I never said the words out loud, it would just fade away. That the truth would stay buried, like everything else in that house. She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with something close to desperation. But it doesn't fade, does it, Mr. Wilkins? Tom shook his head. No, it doesn't. Eleanor exhaled shakily. Then, after a long pause, I want you to tell them. Tom's stomach flipped. You sure about that? She nodded, though her hands were still trembling. I don't want to be the last Kensington who kept this secret. I don't want to die knowing I did nothing. Tom studied her face. For the first time, she wasn't holding on to her past. She was letting go. Finally, the next morning, Tom walked into the local newspaper office, Eleanor by his side. He had expected her to back out at the last second, to change her mind. But she didn't. She sat across from the journalist, hands folded in her lap, and told the story herself. She told them about the hidden gold, the room beneath the house, the names carved into the walls. She told them about Elias. And finally, she told the truth about Jeremiah Kensington. By the time she was done, her hands had stopped shaking, and Tom had never seen her look more free. The story broke within a week. It spread like wildfire. Historians dug into the Kensington name, uncovering documents that confirmed what Elias had written in his letter. The house was declared a historical site, not as a landmark, not as a place of wealth, but as a place of remembrance, a place where the truth had finally been unearthed. Eleanor never went back. She left the house behind, moving into a small apartment in town where she spent her remaining years living, instead of hiding. Tom visited her sometimes, bringing groceries, checking in. She never talked about the gold, or the bones, or the past, because for the first time, she didn't have to. One evening, years later, Tom received a letter. It had no return address, just his name, written in a careful, familiar hand, Eleanor's hand. Inside, there was no long explanation, no dramatic confession, just one sentence. The house remembers what men try to forget, and beneath it, an old gold coin, the last of its kind, The last piece of a story that had finally been told. Tom Wilkins sat on his porch, the old gold coin resting in the center of his palm, catching the late afternoon light. It had been months since the truth about the Kensington house had come out, but sometimes it still didn't feel real. He turned the coin between his fingers, feeling the weight of history pressing into his skin. A stolen fortune, a hidden crime, a past that refused to stay buried. Eleanor had been right all along. The house had remembered. But now for the first time, the world remembered too. And because of that, everything had changed. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His life wasn't perfect. His back still ached from too many years of crawling under houses, and his bank account still wasn't anything to brag about. But something inside him felt lighter, as if for the first time in his life he had done something that truly mattered, something that would last. His phone buzzed against the wooden table beside him. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Eleanor's attorney. "It's ready." Tom inhaled deeply, gripping the coin a little tighter. It was time. The Kensington house had stood untouched for months after the truth was revealed. The authorities had come in, historians had taken their notes, and the press had swarmed the gates like vultures hungry for a scandal. But now, for the first time in over a century, the house wasn't just a symbol of wealth and old money. It was a lesson, a monument to the forgotten, a warning about the cost of silence. Eleanor had signed over the property to the city before she passed away. The moment she made that decision, it was no longer hers. It was no longer theirs. It belonged to history now. History would not be erased again. Tom pulled up in front of the house, stepping out of his truck and gazing up at the facade. It looked different now, though nothing about its structure had changed. Maybe it was just the knowledge that made it feel new. Or maybe for the first time, it wasn't hiding something. He walked up the stone steps and pushed open the newly installed doors. Inside, the grand halls were no longer filled with the weight of secrets. Instead, they held something else entirely, truth. Framed documents lined the walls, detailing the history of the Kensington family, the wealth that had been built on suffering, and the man who had tried to stop it, Elias Kensington. And in the center of the main hall, behind a glass case, sat the letter. The same letter Tom had found in that hidden room. The words that had haunted him now stood in bold ink for all to see. If you are reading this, then you must decide. History remembers the lie, but you can choose the truth. Tom exhaled slowly, his throat tight as he looked around. There are people here now, visitors, students, journalists, all reading, learning. And that was the difference. Before, the house had been a graveyard. Now it was a story, one that couldn't be forgotten again. Months passed. Life moved on. But one evening, as Tom was sitting on his porch, watching the sun dip below the trees, he received something in the mail. A package. No return address. He frowned, ripping it open carefully. Inside, there was a single piece of paper. And the moment he saw the handwriting, his breath caught. Eleanor. He unfolded the letter, his hand shaking slightly. "Tom, if you're reading this, then you already know I'm gone. That's all right. I've made my peace with it. But there's something I never told you, something I wasn't ready to say before. I spent my whole life thinking I was trapped in that house, that I owed it something, that I owed my family something. But I was wrong. I didn't owe them silence. I didn't owe them loyalty. I didn't owe them anything. I only owed the truth. And because of you, I finally paid that debt. So thank you for digging, for pushing, for choosing what's right, even when it was hard. My family built that house on suffering. But because of you, it doesn't have to be a tomb anymore. It can be something else. It can be a beginning. Take care of yourself, Tom, and don't let the past weigh you down too much. You've done your part. Now go alive. Eleanor. Tom sat there, staring at the letter, his throat tight. Then slowly he smiled. A real, genuine smile. And for the first time in a long, long time, he finally let go. The Kensington house still stood, not as a monument to wealth, not as a shrine to privilege, but as a lesson. A reminder that history only stays buried for as long as we allow it to. That truth, no matter how long it is hidden, always finds a way to rise again. And for those willing to face it, it can set them free. Tom had known Eleanor wouldn't live forever, but when a call came, it still hit him like a hammer to the chest. She had passed away quietly in her sleep. No dramatic endings, no last confessions, just a peaceful exit after a long life. The funeral was small, just a few people who had known her, who had cared. Tom stood near the back, listening as the pastor spoke about forgiveness, about time, about the things we leave behind. When it was over, he waited until the crowd had gone before stepping up to her headstone. The engraving was simple. Eleanor Kensington, 1928 to 2025. She chose truth. Tom let out a quiet breath, running his fingers over the words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the coin she had sent him, the last piece of gold from that cursed fortune. He knelt down and placed it carefully on her grave. A symbol, a promise. And then, just like that, he walked away. Because for the first time in a long time, he could